بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Beloved brothers and sisters, honorable Hujjaj, Huffaz, Ulama, mothers and fathers, viewers and listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. My beloved brothers and sisters, Alhamdulillah, in our fiqh, in our previous lesson, we were in Kitab al-Tahara, and we looked at the actions which a person may not engage in the state of a minor impurity. This evening, inshallah, we look at those things that a person may not do in a state of major impurity. In other words, the person in need of a ghusl, a ritual bath. So we are looking at what are the 6 things, the 6 actions that are forbidden, haram, for a person in the state of janaba, the person in a state of major impurity. This individual may not engage in these actions. So the Shaykh writes, وَيَحْرُمُ عَلَى الْجُنُبِ سِتَّةُ أَشْيَاء. The forbidden actions for a person in the state of a major impurity, على الجنوب, يعني in a state of janaba, are 6. The first, الصلاة. ثانيا, والطواف. ثالثا, ومس المصحف. رابعا, وحمله. خامسا, واللبث في المسجد. وسادسا, وقراءة القرآن. So the Shaykh writes that the following 6 things are not permitted for a person in the state of janaba, a major impurity. Firstly, salah. You can't perform salah. Secondly, you can't perform tawaf. Then the next 3 all relate to the Quran. And here we see the difference between a minor impurity and a major impurity. With a minor impurity, you can't touch the Quran. We established that in the previous lesson. But in a state of minor impurity, you can still read it from memory. In a state of major impurity, you can't touch it. You can't carry it. So that we now differentiate between touching the mushaf, the Quran, and carrying it. So the person in a state of major impurity should not pick it up, even though he might or she might be using a piece of cloth that they are not wearing. They should not carry the Quran. And then they also should not recite the Quran. Right? It is preferable not to recite it if you are in the state of major impurity. And then the 6th, to remain in the masjid. So this is a particular reference to those who are in the masjid, perhaps i'tikaf, spending time in the masjid. You fall asleep in the masjid, perhaps in the masjid, in your sleep, a wet dream. And you now wake up. Those who are maybe in i'tikaf, you wake up, or you fell asleep after a waqt, and you wake up and you realize there's, wetness, there are the signs of a wet dream. What do you then do? So you should not remain in the masjid. You should go in. If you're in i'tikaf, you go to the showers immediately. But you don't wait it out unless, of course, maybe the shower is unavailable. Then you shouldn't be in the area of the masjid where salah is performed. So maybe, like in our circumstance, perhaps closer to the shoes and so forth, because it is not permitted to remain in the masjid if you are in a state of major impurity, a state of janab. But what's really critical is number 3, 4, and 5. I think salah and tawaf, we know. You purify yourself with a ghusl to perform salah and to perform tawaf. For 3, 4, and 5, touching the Quran, that we also, I think, are familiar with. Importantly, ihtiram, respect for the Quran. You won't carry it, and then you won't recite it. So again, I also just remind, especially our younger Sometimes they have a habit, they recite, they bacha in the bathroom. you know. So the bachaing generally is a good habit. The reciting is a good habit. But if you're in a state of janaba, don't recite. Okay? Many times I hear parents say, kids, summa bachaing in the bathroom, okay, that's not the place. You wait until you are in an appropriate place to recite the Quran. So just pay important attention to that. And then, of course, al-lubth fil masjid, to remain in the masjid, that is not permitted. So we conclude this evening that the ghusl will be required to lift that state of major impurity. And importantly, we pay appropriate respect to the Quran. Don't touch it, don't carry it, don't recite it in that state of major impurity. So there's a very interesting mas'ala, matter in fiqh regarding a non-Muslim, someone who isn't Muslim, and this person touching a Quran. So if you see a non-Muslim touching a Quran, sometimes Muslims want to react. They say to the non-Muslim, you are not purified to touch the Quran. You shouldn't carry it. What are the etiquettes? So we need to, and this goes into the mas'ala, the matter in fiqh of kufr is a state of major impurity. This is what one opinion is. Hence there is this recommendation in one school of thought, in one madhab, when a person becomes a Muslim, they should take a ghusl. That's one opinion. The other opinion is that it isn't a state of major impurity. It is recommended to take a ghusl. So I've seen in different places, a person takes the shahada, and then the Muslims want to chase the person out of the masjid because you are now impure. So that is not the majority opinion. And then we also reflect on if you have Qur'ans delivered, say being couriered, in all likelihood it's going to be carried by non-Muslim as part of that process. So we recognize the difference here. Yes, we afford the Quran the greatest respect, and we try to, make it very clear that the Quran must be respected, must be raised. And even for a Muslim, in particular for a Muslim, if you're in a state of janaba, don't carry the Quran around, don't touch it, and out of respect, don't recite it as well. And that's how we would afford the appropriate respect to the Quran, inshallah. Any questions about tonight's lesson? Yes. So when we talk about, so the ladies get their own category, which I'm touching on next week, inshallah. And they're going to get their own conditions. Perhaps I'll respond to that. But we also talk about ta'awud ala. Sorry, I didn't repeat the question. The listeners told me, please repeat the question. The question was the ladies that are maybe experiencing haid and they need to recite adhkar, and it contains verses of the Quran. And so in fiqh, we have this concept of being, muta'awud ala tilawati al-Quran. You are accustomed to reciting the Quran. And it's a whole subsection in fiqh of some, for example, a lady who is studying hifz, or a person who commonly recites. So if there is ta'awud established, a tradition, a custom. So let's say, mashallah, in our community, many people are, have memorized Surah Yasin as a tradition. Because of tradition, they can recite it. So there is a subsection in fiqh that speaks to the idea of if you are accustomed to a particular practice, you could continue. But with reference to the respect of the Quran, we recommend that you rather remove the state of impurity to afford the appropriate respect to the Quran, to lift that. But for the ladies' fiqh, inshallah, next week's lesson is dedicated to that. That's definitely okay. So the question is for a lady: can a lady enter the masjid for the purpose of education? I'm going to address that next week because there's specific points relating to education and the ladies, going to the masjid. So there are some additional points that we will touch on, inshallah. The answer is yes and no, and I will explain it next week, inshallah. Stay tuned. Inshallah. Jazakallah khairan. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Muhammad rabbil alamin.